Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling, and thank you for joining us this week on Market Journal. It's our last show of June, so maybe you're getting ready for a fun Independence Day, but regardless, glad you could spend a little bit of your day with us. We've got a good show ahead for you. And beginning the broadcast this week, as crops come up, so do the weeds. And one to keep an eye on this year is Field Bindweed. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh has the story.
Originally from Eurasia, field bindweed is an invasive species that can give producers a run for their money. Nebraska Extension educator Gary Stone says there's two different varieties to watch out for.
You might see two different kinds, but field bindweed, when I say kinds, there's a morning glory that looks a lot like bindweed, but it is different. But bindweed is a vine. It can grow in a spiral. It tends to stay close to the ground, although if it has other plants that it can vine up on, it will certainly do that. It forms some very dense tangled mats. When it does vine up on other plants, it can cause lodging or pull those crops down so that they are hard to harvest. The leaves are generally narrow, but they can be roughly 1 to 2 inches across. They are arrowhead in shape. The flowers are generally white but can be pink, and they're generally trumpet-shaped.
Bindweed seeds are hardy and can survive for long periods of time. This is one of the reasons it can be found in nearly any environment.
Once it got established here, it was probably in some early crop fields, and then when those crops were harvested, had the bindweed seed in it, and it was spread that way. And then it continued across the U.S. for the most part. Some of these seeds can remain viable for over 60 years, so that's another thing that makes it hard to control. Bindweed can grow just about anywhere. It can grow in cropland. It can grow in range and pastures. Generally not so much in rangeland, but it can get started in pastures. It is toxic to some extent to certain animals. It will cause some digestive problems with those animals, but it will not kill them. Other than just being a plant that stays around a long time, takes nutrients from the soil and can crowd out other plants, that's what it really causes.
Finally, when it comes to managing bindweed, an integrated pest management plan is the best place to start. In addition, early identification and removal of roots is important in order to minimize spread.
Well, when you go after field bindweed, you should have an integrated pest management plan. What you eventually want to do is, of course, try to deplete the seed source if you can, but with seeds lasting 60 years, that could be a problem. But go after the root reserves, deplete those, and you will get rid of most of the plants. You can reduce sprouting of the plants by some tillage. You do run the risk of moving those root stalks around, those cut roots that could resprout. There are some insects that have shown some promise, but they have really not done all that well. There's a gall-forming mite that works, and there's a couple of caterpillars that feed on the leaves. So it comes down to some chemical treatments that you would use, primarily something that has some soil activity as well as contact. You need to get that chemical down into the roots to actually do a decent job with this weed. I tell people if they have a bindweed problem, they've probably got it for life because it is a very tenacious weed. It's very hard to manage.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
If you need help setting up an integrated pest management plan, visit pested.unl.edu/creating IPM or contact your local extension office for more information. Time for this week's market segment now, and we've got Iowa State University ag economist Dr. Chad Hart in the chair today. Lots to talk about with the current growing season, trade issues, host of other things too. Chad, starting off, haven't talked to you since the pandemic started, but we had a story on last week's show speaking with Jay Rempe of Nebraska Farm Bureau, and he has a study coming out that estimates as much as $3.7 billion in losses for the Nebraska ag industry due to COVID. What are you guys seeing in Iowa?
Well, we did an early study of it back in April when it was really breaking out here, and we had estimates as high as $6 billion in terms of the impact to the Iowa economy. Now, since that time, we've seen livestock prices bounce back a bit, but the idea is, you're talking multiple billions of dollars worth of damage to various states' economies, especially within agriculture.
Okay, now let's look at some current market conditions. And first day of summer last week, and we've been feeling the heat in many spots, had some storms move through some of our main crop growing areas too. How has the market been reacting to everything?
Well, I think on the weather side, what folks are mainly keying on is the planting progress that we had early, and now basically I'll call it the crop conditions. So they're staring at that, crop progress report. And you're right that, we've got some areas where we've been pretty dry. We've got other areas where we've got, extreme wetness and some flooding going on. But when we look on average across the nation, this crop is looking a little better than usual at this stage of the game. And so the markets have been holding prices down, on fears that we're looking at another set of bumper crops coming this fall.
Looking at corn demand and ethanol production, COVID cases on the rise in some spots throughout the country. And that says to me, maybe folks might have some fears about getting back out on the roads again, as was the case a couple months back. What kind of pressure does that put on corn?
It definitely puts pressure on corn. And if you think about it, back, say 6 weeks ago especially, we saw those ethanol plants shut down. We saw, tremendous drying up of corn demand here internally in the U.S. Since then, we have seen some of those ethanol plants rebound a bit. We're back up to about, I'd say, 75% capacity utilization within the industry. And so as long as we continue to see, the economy's building back up again, we're not getting back to where we were pre-COVID, but at least we're better than we were in the depths of the shutdowns and slowdowns. As long as we can hold on to that, we will churn through some corn, but just not quite at the pace that we expected to at the first of the year.
And how's soybean demand?
Soybean demand, the biggest key here will be the export markets. I think in terms of domestic crush, we have seen that demand pick up a bit, especially if you can think of it this way. As the ethanol industry shut down, that also meant not only a drop in ethanol production, but it dropped distillers' grains production a tremendous amount. Well, you got to feed those animals something. And so we have seen a pickup direct corn demand for feed, but also soybean meal demand. So crush demand's been very strong. It's been the export side that's been lagging, and it's the one that the market is really watching, especially when it comes to China.
And that leads right into my next question regarding China, because the U.S. has been having some meetings with Chinese officials, and a big topic is trade. And we've been seeing lots of questions from people wondering if China is going to be fulfilling their Phase 1 trade agreement. So what do you think?
When we signed this deal with China, it was a target across all of agriculture. And I'd say what we've seen thus far with China is that they are buying more agricultural products, but not at the pace to meet that Phase 1 target. So like right now, when you look at the export sales report from this past week, Chinese sales, our Chinese purchases of soybeans are up roughly 10% compared to a year ago. We're seeing them on the pork side. They're up about 90% compared to a year ago. And even in corn, in a market that China is not known to be actively involved in over the past decade, we have seen China step in and actually triple the amount of corn they purchased this year versus what they did last year.
And with everything that we know right now, what would you suggest that one does with old crop and new crop?
Okay, so new crop, I'm going to preach patience. Right now, the idea is that, especially on the crop side, we haven't seen, if you will, a COVID bounce back yet like we've seen on the livestock side. So it makes sense if you haven't marketed new crop yet, let's not rush into anything. Old crop, though, I think we're facing that challenge. If And especially in this case, as we talked about, crop conditions are looking fairly good. That's meaning we're probably looking at another set of large crops coming along. We need to get our storage facilities ready to handle this new crop. And when it comes to a choice of which crop do I want to have in storage, say next spring, I'm going to tell you it's the 2020 crop, not the 2019 crop. Because we know the 2019 crop was challenged from the get-go, planted late, matured late, harvested late, higher moisture, more problematic in terms of for long-term storage. So I think on the old crop side, we are facing crunch time. We may have to move some crop just to clear space to make sure we've got the room to handle what looks to be a really good 2020 crop.
And Chad, quarterly stocks report on deck for next Tuesday. What are you going to be looking for with this?
Well, I think what we'll be watching, especially on the corn side, is how quick does that recovery on the ethanol side start to eat away at those corn stocks as we're looking here? Because I think that's the biggest number that scares everybody when we're looking forward to this fall, is thinking about the 2020-2021 ending stock number, which right now, if you take USDA's numbers at face value as for in terms of production, we're looking at the potential of a 3.3 billion bushel carryover coming out of the 2020 crop.
And finally, Chad, if there's any marketing or risk management advice that you'd like to leave us with today, the floor is yours.
Well, like I say, in this case, I think now's the perfect time to really sit down and think about what we've got in storage right now. You know, it used to be the old adage that you wanted that storage cleared out by the 4th of July. And to tell you the truth, I think that's still the case, especially as we're looking forward this year. Because I don't want to jeopardize the crop that's growing out in the field by waiting too long on the crop that's already sitting in the bin.
Next week, we'll be joined by Darren Newsom. And if you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll pass your question along. Before we move on from markets today, I also wanted to get in a quick word about cattle with University of Missouri ag economist Dr. Scott Brown. And with us being in the thick of summer grilling season, Scott shares with us where beef demand is and where it needs to be.
Number one, I think the demand hasn't been bad for beef generally. I sometimes say a lot of the upper end beef products tend to be those higher income earners, and I think they've frankly been less affected by COVID-19 than maybe other lower levels of income earners that we see in the country. So I think it's been relatively positive. I think as food service opens, it probably is a bigger boost on the beef side than maybe some of the other markets as we see folks going out. I mean, I always say if you're going to go out and really have a really good dinner, what do you get? And it's beef is normally what folks will answer. So I think there are some good demand signs there. I most worry again about the drag on the economy as we go through the latter part of 2020. It's really too early to know, again, as we saw some of those jobs numbers, which maybe had some issues in terms of what was counted, not what was not counted in terms of job numbers. At least maybe more of a fee recovery might be in the offing if we don't have a second wave, and I think that's helpful to beef demand.
Good info from Scott, for sure. Next up, Keith Green of Greenview Farms, his wife Lori, and his brother Keith farm 14,000 acres of mostly rented land planted to corn and soybean crop rotation in east central Iowa. With only 6 full-time employees, Greenview Farms, which is headquartered in DeWitt, Iowa, relies heavily on 10 or more seasonal part-time employees during planting and particularly during harvesting season to get the job done. With a farming operation that spreads 100 miles east to west and 70 miles north to south across 7 counties, finding and keeping quality and reliable part-time employees every year is a crucial component to the farm's success. Read about Greenview Farms in the June Nebraska Farmer. It's time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, we're about a week into our first full official week of summer. So what's the end of June and the beginning of July look like for us?
Yes, Troy, we've moved into July and it is now what we would officially call summer. And this weekend, we're going to see summer-like temperatures and even worse than that as we get into Monday and Tuesday. During this last week, we had several precipitation chances. The big bust was, of course, Saturday when we were expecting widespread severe weather, and we seen thunderstorm development to the north and south of us, and we kind of got caught in between. robbed of all that moisture. We're getting to the point in time now where the corn crop, if you have an early merged May crop, you're basically using more water now than what typically falls in an average week, and the mid-May merged crop is within about a quarter inch of that. So by the end of next week, all of us, or all the corn crop across the state, will be requiring about 1.5 inches or plus in terms of moisture. And unfortunately, we don't get that much climatologically. So do we have chances in the forecast? Let's take a look at the upper models and see what we can expect. Today's upper air charts show the upper air trough over the Pacific Northwest, a little subtle wave coming through north central portions of Colorado. That's going to generate some surface convergence, basically in southwest of Panhandle, maybe catching up a few showers, particularly in the afternoon. And some of that might move into central Nebraska, although precipitation totals look light. Most of the major convection will remain to the southeast of Nebraska. Then that upper air low starts to pivot toward the northern Rockies, and as we get into the day on Sunday, low pressure develops in western South Dakota and northwestern Kansas. Not a lot of moisture to work with, so once again, just light scattered thunderstorm activity, hit and miss type shower activity with no widespread moisture. On Monday, that trough digs even deeper. Basically, a southerly flow right from the deep south comes up the front range of the Rockies. We're going to see very humid conditions and very warm conditions of the upper air low. Develops a surface low in South Dakota, and most of the precipitations over the northern Rockies. By Tuesday, that low tries to pivot a little bit more into Montana. We see a surface low being depicted by the GFS model to develop in southwestern Kansas. That's going to lead to a little bit of moisture and potentially some thunderstorm development in eastern Nebraska. Now, as we go into Wednesday, that trough starts to flatten out somewhat and bring some energy into the northwest part of the state. Low pressure to our south, that's going to be the big fly in the ointment, whether we can get enough moisture up to interact with this front to generate precipitation in the Panhandle, but it looks like most of it will stay to the north of us in the Dakotas. By Thursday, it looks like that trough's starting to weaken out somewhat, and so we don't have as big of a push into the north central portions of the United States. Therefore, the low in southeastern Montana is likely to keep most of the moisture well to the east and north of us. There is just a shot of precipitation potentially in northeast Nebraska. On Friday, we see a little subtle wave moving through South Dakota and a little low pressure at the surface. It might generate some thunderstorm activity, a very confined area of low pressure. And so the precipitation is very weak at best, and they're showing some returns, but they're not very strong in the southeast part of the state. So overall, it looks like a fairly dry pattern for this next coming week, with basically temperatures well above normal. And that continues for next Thursday, the following Tuesday, as we renew some more heat coming into our region, particularly the post-4th of July period. There's a little bit more uncertainty in terms of precipitation. It does show us above normal. We've seen this trend off and on pretty much for the last few months, and it's busted out on us. More importantly, very dry conditions to the west of us. So overall, it doesn't look very favorable in this upcoming week. So again, Troy, overall looks like fairly warmed conditions and drier than normal conditions this next week. Check out the drought monitor. I would expect if the conditions from this forecast bear out, we will see further expansion of drought in Nebraska as we get into next week's release.
Thanks, Al. Next up, by understanding when Nebraska's aquifers are recharging and susceptible to contaminants, researchers are hopeful to find ways to better enhance our current water management practices. For some time now, a study led by UNL doctoral candidate Mikaela Cherry has been collecting samples and analyzing data. And the findings are pretty interesting. Market Journal's Bill Dodd has the story.
Nebraska's natural groundwater is one of our state's greatest assets. Many ag producers and municipalities are dependent on these wells and aquifers for citizens, crops, and livestock. Recently, a team of university researchers led by doctoral candidate Mikaela Cherry have determined when a majority of our groundwater is replenished. This information is not only important as far as water quantity, but water quality as well. Overall, the findings from this research could have the potential to reinforce our current efforts to limit how much nitrate reaches those reserves.
So for water quality stuff, if we know when recharge is happening, we know when the groundwater is more vulnerable to things like perhaps nitrate contamination or other waste. And then in terms of quantity, if we think about climate change and changes in precipitation patterns and growing seasons, by knowing when the groundwater is recharging, we can kind of get an idea of what to expect in terms of how much groundwater recharge we might be expecting.
According to the National Weather Service, Nebraska gets about 27 inches of rain on an annual basis during the spring and summer months. However, when it rains, or pours, or even floods, A majority of the precipitation that falls on our state in warmer temperatures rarely reaches the depths of our groundwater sources.
So one of the things that we found was that it wasn't as straightforward as we thought it was going to be. So despite the fact that Nebraska gets most of its precipitation during the spring and summer, there's generally too much plant growth for much recharge to occur. So all of the plants and trees and crops and stuff are using all of that rainfall that's coming during the spring and summer. And so it's that little bit of precipitation that we get during the fall and winter before the growing season starts that's really contributing to that recharge. That's a bit of a simplified, I suppose, solution, because if we really dig deep and we look at, kind of our results, is it didn't hold true throughout the state. So like in places where it was heavily irrigated with more pivot irrigation, we saw a different, kind of signature. It looked like it was more summer. Or where there's a lot of canal irrigation, the groundwater looks like canal water, not like precipitation water. And so you really, something producers can know is that it's not necessarily a statewide thing. There's like a specific thing happening on like a more local level that is influenced by things like irrigation and things like that.
New and pre-existing samples confirmed to researchers that the pattern of recharging had been consistent for a number of years. By comparing groundwater samples with correlated precipitation data, the team was able to determine when samples indicated a similar isotopic composition.
The wells that we sampled from were a variety of depths, like less than 100 feet to more than 400 feet. So when you think about like that's a range of groundwater ages in there as well. So like newer groundwater and older groundwater, and they all told the same story. Like they all kind of had the same answer depending on where you were in the state. Which indicates that there's something that's been holding true for the past few decades or perhaps hundreds of years. And it's also a really cool way to revisit data. Like we have all of these old data sets. We have lots of long-term data that the natural resource districts or the conservation survey district has been maintaining. And kind of how we went about this is we had a lot of groundwater samples, over 600 throughout the state, that the different natural resource districts collected. And then we compared the isotopic composition of that groundwater to the isotopic composition of precipitation throughout the year to kind of see like what time of year that recharge is occurring, whether it's during a growing season or a non-growing season, or if there's maybe not a bias. It might be, groundwater recharge is happening throughout the year.
Now that we know when the recharging is taking place, the next step is to learn why these recharging patterns are occurring the way they do. For now, though, producers can take these findings into account when planning their operating strategies.
So if you know you're in a location where the predominant recharge is occurring during the winter, then perhaps maybe fall fertilizer isn't the best solution for that area because that fertilizer has a higher chance perhaps of going into the groundwater. But the thing is we don't know well enough right now to really make perhaps a specific recommendation or conclusion because we're not entirely sure of what's happening in those locations where you see that more of a summer recharge signals. But I would say producers could maybe, always take findings with perhaps a grain of salt. I don't want to try and say, this is the end all answer and you can't do this and it's going to be terrible. But thinking about things like knowing when groundwater is vulnerable, to think about things like fertilizer application or pesticide application.
This research may have the potential to impact the way we view our land stewardship practices in the future. While Mikaela will stop short of making any official recommendations based on the findings, it's certain the work that she and her team have done thus far have given us a greater insight into one of our greatest resources. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. If you'd like to learn more about this research, you can find more information at cropwatch.unl.edu. And we've included a link on the Market Journal website as well. Finally today, you may have heard that June is Renewable Fuels Month in Nebraska. Since 2006, the state's acting governor has dedicated a month to the issue in order to highlight biofuel options. One option is ethanol, of which Nebraska is the second largest producing state. Jeff Wilkerson of the Nebraska Corn Board, and you may remember him as the former host of Market Journal, Jeff is hopeful the ethanol industry will continue to generate a positive effect on the state's economy, especially in the midst of a pandemic.
So in Nebraska, we see that ethanol production has an impact of multi-billion dollars. And so it's not only to local economies, it's to cities as well and industries that have connections to agriculture. Certainly where we saw a huge dip during the coronavirus pandemic and shutdowns across the country, that was noticeable because some of our ethanol production facilities were forced to scale back significantly. So now that we're up and running again, we hope that it's able to positively impact the local and state economy. These are jobs that are above the median income when you look at local areas specifically. And so they're good jobs. They're areas where we need something in the local areas to help support the residential population.
While corn, livestock, and ethanol are key components to Nebraska, Eugene Goering of the Nebraska Soybean Checkoff says there's also the consideration of soybean production and biodiesel.
You know, we talked about that a little bit, that the Golden Triangle has in the past been associated with the ethanol, corn, and cattle industry, but the biodiesel fits very close in that by getting value from the oil and biodiesel, we enable the soybean meal to be more affordable for our livestock producers, the hogs and chickens and dairy and aquaculture. And the majority of soybean farmers are also involved with corn, and the corn and soybeans rotate well. So we feel we're a big part of that same triangle in a slightly different venue.
USDA research has shown ethanol blended emissions are up to 43% less compared to gas without ethanol. In a recent video address, Governor Pete Ricketts pointed to new research from Harvard University that has shown patients with COVID-19 were at higher risk in areas of pollution compared to areas with lower levels of carbon emissions. To learn more about renewable fuels and higher ethanol blends, you can visit biofuel.com or unl88.com. We've also posted a link to Governor Ricketts' video address on the Market Journal website. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. And don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.